Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to Understanding CELF5 Reliability and Validity to Improve Diagnostic Decisions webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Tuesday, October 21st, 2014. But I'd like to turn the conference over to Nancy Castilleja. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. If you are listening to the live webinar event and wish to earn ASHA CEUs for this course, you must attend the entire one-hour session. The handout and all forms you need to complete to obtain CE credit are posted on speechandlanguage.com, where you registered for this course. Please mail the forms to the address posted on speechandlanguage.com. Search for webinar forms. The form must be postmarked no later than Tuesday, November 4th. If you have more than one person at your location, download the attendance sheet and have each person requesting CEUs sign the sheet and complete the ASHA participant form and evaluation form. ASHA requires us to remind you that you cannot decide to earn ASHA CEUs for this course after this date. If you are on the line for less than 60 minutes, or if you do not turn in the ASHA CEU participant form by postmarked by November 4th, you will not have the opportunity to earn ASHA CEUs for this course at a later date. All right, now that we've gotten through all that, we can start the session. Here's Adam.
Thanks, Nancy. I know that CE information is very important, so look for that email to come out later, folks, and you'll be able to send all that information in. And I do truly appreciate anybody who's been part of my webinars in the past. I do truly appreciate all of your feedback, any information that you think you'd like me to change, or any feedback that you have, good and bad, about the content in my presentation. I appreciate that. But let's move on. So thanks for coming, everybody. It's about 1 o'clock my time on the East Coast. I'm in Pittsburgh. It's a little bit rainy and pretty cold here today, so I'm nice and warm inside. But today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics. I know that's always a joke when you hear folks talk about psychometrics as being one of their favorite topics, but I truly do like discussing and understanding reliability and validity as it pertains to specific assessments. And hopefully, as I talk through the session today, you'll understand why that's the case. I think it's very important for us to discuss these topics and to have a thorough understanding of these issues with the assessments that we use, for a lot of clinical reasons. I'm a senior educational consultant with Pearson. I'm also a psychologist, so I'm a professional assessor, as is everybody in this room, all the speech pathologists joining me today. So, we're all on the same page when we talk about, picking an assessment for the right purposes and how we are using the scores, what decisions we're making, and how we actually can interpret those scores. So, this is a great topic for us to really talk about. First things first, I do want to talk about disclosures. I am an employee of Pearson, and we do publish the CELF5, and we won't be talking about any other assessments during today's presentation. I don't have any other non-financial disclosures to talk about. In terms of our agenda today, this is a brief agenda. We do have an hour. We are going to talk, we're going to talk during that hour, hopefully not too fast. Hopefully I have enough information. Just this quick introduction period. The research overview section is going to be the bulk of it. We're going to talk some about standardization information, and then we're going to really dive into reliability and validity. And then we are going to have some time for, a little bit of a summary and some questions there at the end. So if you have any, please feel free to put them in the box that you see on the bottom left. And if I can't get to it during today's session, I'm asking my colleague Nancy to maybe highlight those questions, and I can get to them at the end if we don't have any time. All right. Here are the learning objectives very quickly. Oh, I guess it didn't change the screen yet. Sorry about that. Here are the learning objectives very quickly. Hopefully we'll get to all of them to everybody's satisfaction. They will all be on your ASHA CE forms, so all that information will be there for you. Okay. Let's dive into the research overview. So one of the reasons I want to start with this information is because anytime we talk about looking at test scores, we have to understand where the information comes from, where the information for norming comes from. And the reason is we really want to be able to tell that the scores and the testing that we're using is representative of the child or of the person, of the examinee that we're testing, right? So this is where I like to start this type of a discussion, and you'll see how it flows into the discussion about reliability and error later on, and also validity, really a little bit more about validity and understanding that, when we have a score, we can actually interpret that score for the child that we're testing. So starting about research, there were multiple research phases, and I'm not going to go into those in detail, but the research phases are quite extensive. For the CELF5, there were over 4,000 students that were in the standardization as well as the reliability and validity studies. So that's a large number of students included, and that does span all three of these phases: standardization, reliability, and validity. They were tested from March through December of 2012, and a lot of you may have actually participated in that. So there were over 450 speech pathologists from around the U.S. that participated. So, maybe some of you participated. That's great. But the representation was pretty widespread across the country. When we look at bias studies as well, for some reason I'm not getting a change here. Okay, sorry. Sometimes my internet is not changing quick enough, so I'm concerned about that when I talk. But anyway, in terms of bias studies, we look at evaluating for bias and being able to correct for bias throughout multiple phases of the research, and really looking at the administration directions, looking at cues that are given throughout the test, looking at the test items in specific, or any of the pictures that are in the test items, and also the formats. And what's done then is assessment and bias experts look at all of those information, look at all that information for any potential bias that's related to any of these categories that I have listed here: SES, race and ethnicity, gender, culture, religion, or region. And that is a really a very effective format to use. What's important to realize is that any amount of bias can't be removed from a test. It can be controlled to as significantly as we can. We can control it. We can remove as much bias as possible by really making sure that we're looking at it throughout multiple phases, making sure that experts are removing items or removing components of a test that may affect bias. But bias is anything that can affect a test score, right? So that can't be removed completely. But it is looked at pretty significantly throughout the test development process, okay? What happens then is that clinicians in the field, after the bias experts examine everything, clinicians in the field will give feedback about the responses and their engagement in the tasks, and then they do look at statistical analyses, really to be able to take out or take out and reduce or remove as much of that bias as possible. And that's really the process by which it goes under. When we're looking at who's involved in the standardization sample, we want to make sure that it is representative of our population, right? So looking at the most recent census data, we want to make sure that it is representative of us as a cultural makeup of race and ethnicity, our cultural makeup. We want to make sure that it's reflective of parent education levels across the country. So we can see here that this is reflective of current census data in terms of parent education level for the students involved. Also in terms of region. So this is also representative of that as well. And we can see that we have a pretty wide representation across the country of different regions as well. In terms of, here's the gender as well. So we can see that it is split completely down the middle, 50-50 female and male. So now that we've reviewed that information, important to look at are the raw score means and standard deviations for each of the CELF5 tests. And again, this is for each age group in the norm sample. Now, this is the first part of the whole chart. The chart is much larger, and hopefully in the handouts that I sent you, you're able to see these charts a little bit better because I put them on 2 slides per page, really to blow them up a little bit so that you can see them a little better. But hopefully this kind of comes through for you can see them okay. But the next part of from age 10 up will be on the next slide. So this is the first part up through 9-11. The next part, 10 and up, will be on the next slide. So let's review the abbreviations because we're going to see these abbreviations across many of the slides that I talk about today. And this is just to orient you so that we're all on the same page. But on the left-hand side of the screen, You can see the tests here. They are going to be as follows. SC is sentence comprehension. LC is linguistic concepts. WS is word structure. WC is word classes. FD, following directions. FS is formulated sentences. RS is recalling sentences. USP is going to be understanding spoken paragraphs. WD is word definitions. SA is sentence assembly. SR is semantic relationships. PP, pragmatics profile. RC is reading comprehension. And SW is structured writing. Just want to make sure I got that out for everybody so that you're familiar with the different abbreviations we see on the left-hand side. So what you can see here is that the raw score means increase across the ages. And that really is a reflection of growth and development of the skills. So, for example, if we look at, let me remove those. If we look at recalling sentences, which is RS right here, we see that for a 5-year-old through 5 years, 5 months, the mean raw score is 20.7, right? But if we go up to the 9 through 9-11 age range, the raw score increases. It jumps up to 47.7. So what that really means is that that's a reflection, it's a direct reflection of growth, skill, and development. The raw score basically reflects skill growth. So what we're saying is that a 5-year-old has less skill for recalling sentences in that area than a 9-year-old will. Okay. Now you can also see that the standard deviations will decrease by age, and of course that's true for everything except word definitions and structured writing. And really that's because there's less variability of scores as an examinee or a group becomes more proficient in the skill that's being tested. Right? So you can see that for formulated sentences for FS. Let me remove these to go back. For FS, the standard deviation for 5-year-olds is 6.6, which is right here, and it increases slightly. Up to 9/11 for 9/11. Right? It increases a little bit up there, but on the next slide here, when you see from 10, where's FS? Right there. It drops down to 7.0, and then for 17 through 21, it drops down to 4.4. Okay, so that's what we expect. We expect to see less variability as someone becomes more proficient in a skill that's being tested. Right. So I think that what we're seeing here is really just that for the CELF5. Raw scores increasing with age, standard deviations, by and large, decreasing with age. Okay, so what you can also see here is that the means for across understanding spoken paragraphs, which is USP right here, and reading comprehension, which is down here, do not follow the typical pattern. And this is because the item sets for these tests, so they are presented in item sets or paragraphs, they change at each 2-year interval. So that really does affect the standard progression of not only the mean but also the standard deviation. You won't see the same pattern with those two tests. All right, so with that very basic information to start with, let's move into reliability, which is, again, going to be a large bulk of our discussion today. So I'd like to start this out with, I call it Reliability 101. Let's start with a real basic primer or, early course about what reliability is, just so that we're all on the same page when we actually look at the numbers. So this topic is very important because it's only through understanding of statistical properties of a test that an examiner or yourself or myself can really form confidence in the accuracy and precision of the scores that we get from a student. Okay. Psychometric properties that are really critical to interpreting test scores include things like reliability and stability coefficients, standard errors of measurement, or you'll see them listed as SEM, confidence intervals, statistical significance of differences between scores, or they're also called critical values, and the frequency of score differences or prevalence. So let's talk about reality, sort of this intro here, right? The first question I have up there is, how confident are you in the accuracy of a test score? And I think that's really the question that we're answering when we look at reliability scores or reliability numbers. We want to think about the accuracy of that score and what that actually means. And that is, if the same unchanged student is repeatedly tested under identical conditions, if we test them over and over again, same conditions, consistency can be expected among their scores. So we should expect them to get the same score from time 1 to time 2, or very similar scores. Now, although this theoretical situation can never really be obtained absolutely, we can't expect them to get the exact same score every single time they take the test. We do have various estimates of reliability during practice, and that's where we look at these reliability numbers. So think about reliability as being the accuracy, the consistency, and the stability of test scores across situations. So I like this little formula down here at the bottom. I always think about the true score, or what a child's score should actually be, as being the observed score plus any error. Okay, that observed score is the test score that we actually get. So let's say we give the CELF5, we give formulated sentences, and we get a specific score on that test. That is the observed score. Their true score is whatever you're getting plus any error that's involved, okay? Now, measurement error has both systematic and it's going to have random errors involved in it. But a reliable test is going to have a relatively small number of these errors and really be able to provide consistent scores within and then across administrations. Now, sometimes we do pass this over in our interpretation of an examinee's performance, and I think that's common sometimes. We do pass that over. We pass over the error that's involved in a score. But it's important that the reliability of a test score and systematic error should be always considered when you're interpreting the scores. When you look at a score, you always have to take into consideration any error that may be inherent there, any of the systematic or the random error that may be involved. Okay? So let's look at internal consistency and test-retest. All right. The reliability of the CELF5 was evaluated using internal consistency, test-retest stability, and interscore reliability, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later on. First, internal consistency. Let's talk about that. Internal consistency reliability basically estimates how consistently the items of the test measure one construct, or in other words, really looking at the coefficient allows us to determine how homogeneous items are in a particular test. We want to make sure that if we have a test, those items are fairly homogeneous or fairly similar, that we're measuring the same construct. Now, the internal consistency of the CELF5 test and the composite scores were examined using something called the split half method, which is the correlation between the total scores of two halves of the test. And then that's corrected with something called the Spearman-Brown formula for the full test. Okay. Another way of looking at reliability is to examine test-retest stability. So test-retest stability is the correlation between a test and then a retest score. So to look at this, a student has to be given that same test twice. We know that a student, like I said before, won't perform exactly the same way in each of the two test sessions, but how close those performances are will help us determine stability over time. Okay? That time interval between the test and retest has to be as short as possible to evaluate this, and really that's to minimize any changes to the student, any changes to their skill or their ability to perform the test. But it has to be long enough that any of the practice or the memory effects really go away. Okay? All right, so let's look at some of those numbers. Okay, so here on the screen you can see the test reliability coefficients. So internal consistency reliability coefficients were determined for both the normative sample and the clinical samples. Here we're going to look at the norm sample coefficients, and we will look at some of the clinical sample information later on. Okay, as the data that you're seeing in this table are showing you, the average reliability coefficients for the CELF5 tests for the norm sample range from 0.75, which we have down here for structured writing, to 0.98, which is for the pragmatics profile. Okay, linguistic concepts, word classes, following directions, recalling sentences, sentence assembly, and the pragmatics profile all have average coefficients that are considered excellent. So what that means is that any number that is equal to or above 0.90 is considered an excellent or a very high reliability coefficient. They range from 0.90 to 0.98, which are all very high. Sentence comprehension, word structure, formulated sentences, understanding spoken paragraphs, word definitions, semantic relationships, and reading comprehension all have what they consider good reliability, and that ranges from 0.85 to 0.89. Now, the coefficient for structured writing, that 0.75, while that's the lowest, it is still considered to be adequate. Okay? So it's really an adequate representation of error. What I want to tell you, that because the pragmatic activities checklist has a criterion score, it has a criterion cut score, so you don't really see a standard score for that test. It's not included in these analyses, so that's why I don't have it listed up here. These internal consistency reliability coefficients that you're looking at are then going to be used to determine critical values for confidence intervals. And you can find those confidence intervals in the examiner's manual. The confidence interval is something that we're all familiar with, right? We look at the band around a score with which we can have a fair amount of confidence that a score will fall within. That is determined based on these internal consistency coefficients. Okay, so here are the next slide that we're looking at here are the coefficients for the index scores. You can see that they all range from 0.95 and 0.96, and they're all considered excellent. Again, remember, any coefficient that you see that is equal to or greater than 0.90 is considered excellent. The correlation coefficients of the composite scores are going to be higher than the reliability coefficients of the individual tests, which we saw in the previous slide. And that's expected because the index scores summarize a student's performance on a broader sample of language abilities, and they have more items than a single test has. So the error is going to be much less when you're looking at an index rather than a specific score. So they're all very high. Okay. Now, I did talk about how we also have the reliabilities for clinical groups. Now, this first part of the chart here with sentence comprehension through recalling sentences, the rest of the tests are going to be on the next slide. I'll show you them in a minute. Now, these were obtained from a sample of 301 students, and they were in 3 different groups: the language disorder group, learning disability for reading and or writing, and autism spectrum disorders. Now, because the tests were not appropriate to the ages of the students in the clinical groups, students in the learning disability group didn't take sentence comprehension, linguistic concepts, or word structure. Also, the composite score reliabilities aren't listed here because there was a small sample size for most of the clinical groups, so those aren't listed here as well. All right, let's do a quick interpretation of these numbers. What you see here is that the reliability coefficients for most of the clinical groups here are either higher than or similar to those coefficients that we saw in the norm sample. And what these numbers indicate is that the CELF5 is equally reliable for measuring the language skills of students in the general population as it is for measuring students with clinical diagnoses. So this information is very important. If you think about it, most of the time, if not every time, you get a referral for a language evaluation, the question of diagnosis or the classification of a disorder is going to be on the table, right? So what you have to make sure is that whenever you're looking at error involved in a test, that error is acceptable not only for the general population, but also for clinical groups that you may be seeing. And that's what this information really helps us determine. We want to be able to see these high numbers to make sure that when we're testing kids in these clinical groups, that the error is acceptable, that we don't have a high number of error, high amount of error for a specific clinical group, because really it makes this test useless for that particular group, right? We don't want to be using a test that has too much error for a specific group. It doesn't make any sense. We can't really interpret those scores. So this information, we don't often look at this information, but that really helps us when we're looking at interpreting based on a specific clinical group or child that we're seeing that falls into one of these groups. So here is the rest of that information going from understanding spoken paragraphs to reading comprehension. And you can see here as well, we're all in the good to excellent range. Look at that, a 0.81 I think I see here as the lowest for language disorder group and understanding spoken paragraphs, still considered a good level statistic. Okay? All right. I do have a question that just came through, because since we're still on reliability, what was the time interval used on the CELF5 when conducting test-retest reliability? I am pretty sure that I have that information coming. If I don't have it, I do have that information coming, Chris. So it'll be coming up in a minute. I'm pretty sure I have the averages coming up on a few more slides. If I don't, I'll make sure that we get that information before we finish reliability. Okay, so standard error of measurement. Reliability coefficients are useful for evaluating a test consistency of measurement for a group of students, but they really don't directly apply to the interpretation of individual test scores. So that's what standard error of measurement helps us do. It helps us interpret or evaluate the consistency of specific individual test scores. So here we see the standard error of measurements for all of the tests and composites for ages 5 through 9/11. Again, all the SEMs for ages 10 and up are going to be on the next slide. So basically, the standard error of measurement gives you an estimate of the amount of error in a student's observed test score. The SEM is inversely related to the reliability of a test. So the greater the reliability, the smaller the SEM. And basically, therefore, the greater the confidence you'll have in the precision of an observed test score. So what the SEM helps you do is it helps you get a sense of how much the student's score is likely to differ from his or her true score, and how much the student's scores may vary if they have to take the test again. So measurement error is going to be commonly expressed in terms of standard deviation units. And what I mean is the SEM is the standard deviation of the measurement error distribution. Basically, you use the SEM to place a confidence interval around a student's score. Now, you've all heard of confidence intervals, which is what we look at to determine a range of confidence that a person's score would occur again. Okay? The larger SEMs for composites in this table don't necessarily indicate a higher level of error in those scores than the test scores, but rather the greater variability of composite scores. And the composite scores are more accurate measures than the individual test scores. So if we look at this, additionally, what we have to think about is that I just lost my thought. Anyway, what I want to talk about here is the SEMs. So basically what we're looking at here is we want to make sure that the SEMs are going to be smaller. So every time you see a test with high reliability, the smaller the SEM is going to be, which means that the smaller the range around a score is, that may include error, right? So if we're looking at a child here that's taking formulated sentences, for example, and we're looking at the age range of 5.0 through 5.5, an SEM of 0.95, we essentially are saying plus or minus 1 around a score, around that score is really what we're looking at in terms of the standard error. The confidence interval is determined that way. So we really have a very small range around that score that we have to be concerned about as being a possible error, right? So the smaller it is, the less amount of error around a specific score. What we're seeing down here, and one of the reasons we see this down here is because these scores are also higher, right? So we're looking at specific test scores, and we're looking at composite scores down here at the bottom. So these tests are going to be a little bit larger. All right. Let's go on to the next slide, which really shows us the next part of it, which is through 10.0 through 21.11. We're looking at the average SEMs here. We have very low. 1.1, I see 1.1, 1.53 for tests. So really we're looking at an average there that is around 1. We even have SEMs as low as 0.76, which are very low. 0.38 for pragmatics profile, all very low. So basically, again, this is really the band around a specific score that is a representation of that specific test's error. Okay. Test-retest stability. So I do have that information in here. For the CELF5, the test-retest stability was evaluated by administering the test to a sample of students on 2 separate occasions and then comparing the scores. The sample used to assess the test-retest included an N of 137, so that's 137 students, and they were in 3 age bands. The ages were 5 through 6.11, 8 through 9.11, and 12 through 16.11. And they were basically selected from the standardization sample. The retest occurred within 7 to 46 days, so it was anywhere from 7 to 46 days, but the mean was 19 days. So hopefully that answers your questions. That came before, Chris, but the retest average there was 19 days. And also both tests were administered by the same examiner. So what you see in this data is that the CELF5 test scores possess good stability over time for all of the 3 age groups tested. The average coefficients for recalling sentences was excellent. You see that the average coefficient for recalling sentences was 0.90. The average coefficients for linguistic concepts, for word structures, for understanding spoken paragraphs, for word definitions, for sentence assembly, and for pragmatics profile are all good. They're all in the 0.80 range. And for the other tests, they're adequate. Again, 0.70. In addition, the average corrected stability coefficients of the composite scores are all good to excellent. And you can see down here, they all range from 0.83 to 0.90. And so they're all considered in the excellent range. This data also shows us that the mean retest scores are higher than the scores for the first testing. So if we look at the mean retest score, we see that they're all going to be higher than they were on the first test. Okay? And if we're looking at the effect sizes range from 0.04 to 0.54. I don't think I have the effect sizes on this one. I don't. I apologize. I don't have the effect sizes on this one. But basically what we're looking at there is the difference between the two scores. So we have a slightly higher test on the retest than we do on the first go-around in there as well. Okay, so inter-score agreement. Let's go into this in a little more detail. Most CELF5 tests are going to be scored objectively. However, these four that I have up here, word structure, formulated sentences, word definitions, and structured writing, they test and examine, they basically are tested and require an examiner to be familiar with some scoring criteria and apply some clinical knowledge, qualitative and quantitative judgments about how the student responds. So when they're administered, the examiner has to apply specific judgment to score the item. Now, because there's some room for interpretation on those tests, now that room is very small, but there is some room for interpretation, it's necessary to evaluate the extent to which those interpretations are consistent from one score to another. Now, these inter-score reliability coefficients were calculated according to appropriate inter-class correlation procedures and the total test raw scores that were used in the analysis. So you can see the inter-score reliabilities range from 0.91 for word definitions to 0.99 for word structure, and they're all very high. And basically what that means, this information means, is that for any of the tests that have a slightly subjective scoring procedure, scoring criteria, the consistency from one examiner to the next is fairly good. Not fairly good, it's very good. If you look at these numbers, it's very high. So you can feel very confident that whenever you're applying a fairly objective or fairly subjective scoring, that most examiners are scoring it exactly the same way. I threw this last slide in here because as practice related to the numbers that we just looked at, we must interpret the differences between scores on any test that we administer. So if a student gets a higher score on the expressive index compared to the receptive index, for example, what does that mean? Does it mean anything? So to answer those kinds of questions, we have a two-step process that first looks at standard error and then the prevalence of the difference in the population. So in practice, let's say we see a kid with a split between, let's say, expressive and receptive communication. Our first step is to determine if that difference is statistically significant, which, again, is a reflection of error. Then we will look at the magnitude of that difference and how often that occurs in the population. We say that if it occurs in less than 15%, around 15 to less than 15% of the population, we consider that rare. And that means that then we interpret the difference. Oftentimes, we find that the difference between an individual's index scores is statistically significant, but it occurs with surprising frequency among students in the general population. So, this two-step process is important, and the reason I have it up here because it is a reflection of error. If a child gets a higher score, let's say they get 100 on receptive communication and an 80 on expressive communication, we need to make sure that that difference occurs outside of the error that we expect between tests. And that's what we look at for statistical significance. And then we have to say whether or not that 20-point difference, just in our example, if that occurs in a large amount of the population or not. If it does, we say that it's not rare, that difference occurs in a lot of the population. If it's rare, we say, hey, that's clinically significant because it's outside of the standard error that we're expecting, and in addition to that, it only occurs in a very small amount of the population. So I know that this is a process. You see this on record forms all the time when you are looking at score comparisons, the pairwise difference comparisons and so forth for index scores, for test scores. But I wanted to show you this here because that's why we do it. This is really a reflection of the psychometrics that I just showed you and how we apply that for our interpretation purposes. All right. I do see some questions coming through. Let's see here. So I did have a question that came through. What is happening when a score is less reliable? So you mean when a score has a lower reliability coefficient? Well, there could be any number of things happening in that case. It could be just error that's included in the general population. So based on the norming sample, it could be based on the characteristics of that sample. It could be based on specific error that's inherent in any test, any systematic error that's included in the test. Also, there, like I talked about, that random error is also included there too. So it could be anything that we can't account for. Okay. When discussing the true error, the true score, I got a question that came through. When discussed, the true score plus error, is error the SEM? So error is any of the error that we talked about before, the random error or the systematic error. So it's any error included in the test is that error that I talked about. So true score is observed score plus error. The error is any of the systematic or random error included in the test. Okay. And I have another question coming through. I'll get to that in a little bit. Get to that last question in a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about validity. So part 2 of this discussion does go to validity. So let's do, again, a basic validity 101 so that we're all on the same page here. Basically, what we're trying to do is answer the question of how well can your test results predict the presence of a disorder or predict a person's skill. Right? That's the question that we're answering when we're looking at validity. In a little bit more detail, test validity does refer to how much support we have from data, from research, or from theory that a test measures the concepts that it says it measures. Also, we're looking at whether the test is acceptable or applicable to an intended population. So if we're using this test for a specific kid, we want to make sure that it applies to that population, the population that we're actually looking at. We demonstrate validity by providing evidence to support how we use and how we interpret a test. So we look for many sources for information for validity, and that includes evidence based on test content, evidence based on response processes, evidence based on internal structure, evidence based on relationships with the prior version of the test and with other tests that measure the same constructs. And also we look for evidence based on special group studies. An examiner has to often evaluate whether or not the evidence of a test validity really makes sense for the use that for what they're using the test for the purpose of the test. So you have to be able to sit back and think, is there enough validity evidence to support why I'm using this test and for who I'm using it for? And this is something that I think as practitioners we always have to kind of come back to and determine that. I mean, sometimes we pick up tests and don't quite look at the validity information, but this information, again, really gives us the power to be able to interpret a test score for the particular kid that we're giving it to. Right? This is really where that information comes from. So, in terms of evidence based on test content, this is how we evaluate validity here. Let's talk about test content first. By looking at relationships between the content of a test and the construct it's intended to measure, we can get important source of evidence about the validity of test scores. We have support for validity related to test content when the content areas being measured are, we'll say, quote-unquote, accepted as relating to the proposed construct. We call that content relevance. Also, when the content areas measured by the test are accepted to adequately sample those areas, we call that content coverage. So we want to make sure that it's relevant. We want to make sure that within research, we have enough information in theory. We have enough information that what we're measuring what we say we're measuring, and we want to make sure that we're measuring things with enough coverage. So we gather evidence of validity in several ways, and that includes literature review, feedback from users, and expert review and suggestions. So experts give info about the language areas and skills that the test should address, as well as they'll give information about the breadth and the appropriateness of the test and the item coverage. So to start, we must know what the CELF5 is supposed to measure. If we're just picking up a test, we have to know what it's supposed to measure to say that we can actually, that's what we need it for, right? Well, basically, the CELF5 was designed to reflect the development of language ability for students ages 5 through 21 years. Now, the goal of the content was to make sure that the tests and the test items on the test were able to adequately sample all of the different language domains. So it's a pretty comprehensive test of language ability. That was the focus, and that was the goal of the content. Also, for the CELF5, particular attention was paid to content that reflects more complex linguistic processes of adolescents and young adults. Okay, so that's really the first step when we're thinking about validity, making sure we know what the test is supposed to measure. So we expect tests that measure similar abilities to have moderate to high correlations, right, which would be an evidence of convergent validity. And that's why I have this slide up here. We're looking at intercorrelation studies between the tests on the CELF5. Other tests would be expected to have low to moderate intercorrelations, okay? We can see that to be the case between tests of social language or pragmatics and a test that measures primarily semantics and syntax. We would expect the correlations to be moderate to low, right? We wouldn't expect social language and semantic tests to be very related, right? But we would expect two tests that measure syntax to be related. We would expect them to be correlated, at least moderately to highly correlated. Also, the low correlations represent divergence in the constructs as well as they should. So whenever you're looking at low correlations, there should be a divergence between those two constructs. So they should be a low correlation between two tests that aren't measuring the same things. So in this table, we see the intercorrelations between tests and composite scores for each of the CELF5 age groups. The core language score, which is CLS down here at the bottom, right? That's that line there, and this line up here. The core language score has a high correlation with most of the index scores. The expressive language index and the receptive language index have moderate to high correlations with other index scores. Now, the index scores for language content, for language structure, and for language memory correlate moderately with one another, but at a lower level than the other associations. And really what this data suggests to us is that there is some divergence in measurement. That divergence really supports the idea that these scores represent different aspects of language. If you look at the correlation of the test scores with the index scores, it confirms that pattern. Higher correlations are observed between test scores and the index scores for which they're part of than between tests that are independent of the index scores. All right, so we're expecting to see any of these tests that are included in a specific index to be higher, correlated higher with those than they are with another index, for example. So let me see if I can find one here for you. So receptive language index. Let's look at following directions, which is right. Let me remove this here so we can see a little bit better. Let me give you a red pen. Okay. Following directions, which is right here, right? We expect following directions to be highly correlated with the receptive language index, which is Sorry, let me look at it this way. This will be a little bit easier for me. So if I look down this one here, and I would look at following directions, we're looking right here. So it's 0.64. We expect that higher correlation, right? But we don't expect following directions to be highly correlated with anything else. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense for it to be correlated with a test that isn't a receptive test. So let's look at something like formulated sentences, which is FS. So if we look down FS, or here we go, 0.51. Okay, so that's not a high correlation between formulated sentences and following directions. That's not a high correlation, 0.51, and that's expected, right? So that's the pattern that we look for in this type of a chart. We're looking for high correlations between tests that are similar and the indices that they're related to, and we're looking for low correlations between tests that are not related, and we're looking for low correlations between tests that are not related to specific indices. Okay, and that's what we're looking for here. And if you look at all the scores that are involved here, I know there's a lot of numbers on this screen. But basically, look at this at your leisure, and you'll see all of that information basically laid out for you, okay? All right. Additionally, we'll look at the relationship of the CELF5 tests with other similar tests. We want to make sure that if we are looking at something specific and there is another test that measures that construct, that we have some consistency between the two. So the CELF4 is a perfect example. Despite having obvious differences between the two tests, both were designed to measure developing language skills in children through young adults, ages 5 to 21 years. So to that end, we need to look for similarities between the two to support the construct assessment of the tests. So we want to make sure that there is a similarity between the two tests enough to support that we are looking at the same constructs. So based on the design and application of the CELF5 and CELF4, we should expect a high positive correlation between the composite scores. On this slide here, we have the mean and standard deviations for both the CELF5 and CELF4 administrations. On the next slide, we're going to look at the correlation coefficients. So basically what we're seeing here is that these are the mean scores for CELF5. These are the mean scores for CELF4, okay? Let's look at the next slide. Really shows us the important information. And as we should expect, the composite scores here have a higher positive correlation. We're looking at here are the correlation coefficients between CELF4 and CELF5 administrations. Okay, but the composite scores have a high positive correlation, even despite changes in the configuration of the test that comprise the core language score and the other index scores between the CELF4 and 5, as well as the different sample characteristics on which the test norms are based. So this correlation coefficient, the corrected R here, the core language score 0.88, that's a very high correlation. So that's what we should expect that. And these are all going to be higher than what we see on the specific tests up here, okay? What this tells us is that the CELF4 and CELF5 measure similar language behaviors. Correlations between all CELF5 and CELF4 index scores are going to be high there. You see them, they're all in the 0.80 range. At the composite or index level, the effect sizes are all less than 0.20. You can see that over here in terms of the standard difference. We're looking at the less than 0.20. And that indicates the difference between the CELF5 index scores and the CELF4 index scores are negligible. Now, although we see a greater variability up there at the top, at the test score level than at the composite score level, many of the tests have similar mean score differences. The test scores follow the same general trend that's seen with the composite scores in that many of the CELF5 test scores means are slightly higher than the CELF4 subtest score means. We can attribute this to changes in the population, okay? Changes in the population from the CELF4 to the CELF5 norming. And we've seen this phenomenon before. That was seen most recently with the PLS5 revision. So we do see that those scores slightly increase from one population, from one revision to the next. PLS4 to PLS5, that was witnessed, and again here for CELF4 to CELF5. This info tells us that CELF4 and CELF5 scores are going to be highly correlated, or they are highly correlated, because they measure similar constructs in language. Okay, let's look at the language disorder information, the language disorder study. So again, it's important for us to determine how well a test of language shows us or reflects the actual skill of a person with a language disorder. So to do that, a control sample was selected to match the language disorder group based on demographics. And as we expect, of course, we would expect that someone with a language disorder will perform worse than someone without a language disorder. Here are the means and standard deviations, and on the next slide we'll look at the group comparisons. But basically what we see here is the language disorder means and standard deviations. Oops, I'm sorry. Language disorder means and standard deviations. We see that the means for the language disorder group range here from, I see a low of 5.2, a low of 4.5, all the way up to 6.9. And for the matched sample, we have just about average, 9 to 10 range. Again, for the index scores, we see averages ranging in the 70s, and for the matched sample, we have averages in the high 99s to 101s. Okay, and looking at this information here, this is a group comparison statistic, which means that we're looking at the standard deviations, the means, the t-values, and the standard differences of the CELF5 standard scores between language disorder and the matched control sample. So the standard difference, it's also called Cohen's D, is the effect size. And that expresses the difference between the two scores in standard deviation units. And this allows us to compare the discrepancy of scores across tests and indices. Effect sizes of 0.5 are considered moderate, and those of 0.8 and above are considered large. And as we see here, the largest effect sizes, which are greater than 0.20, are seen with core and index scores. So, as I talked about, I just mentioned that 0.80 and above are considered large. 0.20 is very large. It's very high. And let me just talk about some other information. I'll talk about what that means. For word classes, formulated sentences, and reading comprehension, we have the largest effect size for the tests. So again, we're looking at 0.20 here as well for the test effect sizes, the differences. However, the effect sizes for the other tests, they're all large. They're all over 0.90. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, basically, what that tells us is that the CELF5 is very good at discriminating between typically developing students and those with language disorders. So when you see scores like this, basically what this is telling us is that when we're evaluating a student, and they have a low score, and they have low scores, we're saying that it's likely that they have a language disorder. Okay, we're very good. The CELF5 is very good at picking up language disorders and discriminating a child with language disorder from a typically developing child. Okay. All right. Sensitivity and specificity 101. I always like this discussion too. Sensitivity and specificity. What does this stuff mean? Let's talk about the basic information involved here, and then I'll talk about what it means for the CELF5. We have about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to end early, or we're going to end so that Nancy can talk about the rest of the CE information. So we have about 5 more minutes. Let me get through this information quickly. Basically, sensitivity means the probability that someone who has a condition will test positive for it. So if somebody has a language disorder, the test scores or the results of a test are going to show that they have a language disorder based on a specific cutoff. Specificity means the probability that someone who does not have a condition will test negative. So if I don't have a language disorder, I'm not going to test. My test scores aren't going to show that I have a language disorder. Okay. In terms of errors, a false positive error is a student who is falsely identified as having condition or disorder. So let's say that I'm normal, I'm typically developing, and my test scores show that I have a language disorder. That's considered a false positive. A false negative is when a student with a disorder, let's say a student has a language disorder, and their test scores do not show that they have that disorder. And that's considered the most serious form of error, because basically what you're doing is you're excluding someone from a group. You're saying that even though they have a disorder, they're not meeting the criteria for the disorder. In terms of the diagnostic accuracy of the CELF5, we see here the clinical validity studies or statistics for students with language disorder. And then, of course, we have based on cut scores of 1. The cut scores over here are going to be standard deviation cut scores of 1, 1.3, 1.5, and 2 standard deviations below the mean for core language scores, receptive language index, and the expressive language index score. Oftentimes, I talk with folks about, in most parts of the country that I talk to, their cut scores are at negative 1.5 standard deviation or 77 standard score. But I know that does vary from location to location. So with a cut score of -2 standard deviations, specificity is excellent at 0.10. Basically, it has everybody there, right? But with a sensitivity at 0.57, it means that only the most severely language-impaired students are going to be identified as having a language disorder. So if you're at -2 standard deviation, only kids that are getting a standard score of 70 and below are going to qualify, and that means that those are the kids with the most severe language disorders. What about the kids that are in between, right? We see that with a cut score of 80 at a -1.3 standard deviation, the results have the best balance between specificity and sensitivity. In other words, using a cut score of 80, only 3% of children with a language disorder were missed, and only 3% of children without language disorders were misidentified as having language disorders. So that 3% is very low. So we see that that is the best balance between 0.97 and 0.97. At 1.5 standard deviation cutoff, we see that the sensitivity and specificity have a little bit more variation there. So let's talk about what that means, okay? Let's apply that to an actual example. This is a hypothetical. This is you're using the 1.5 standard deviation cutoff of 77 with the CELF5. Let's say that you're in a district with 10,000 students, and you have a disorder with about 10% prevalence. Let's say this language disorder has about a 10% prevalence rate. If we have 10,000 students, okay, that means 1,000 students will have a language disorder, 9,000 students will not have a language disorder. With the CELF5, if you're using the 1.5 standard deviation cutoff, that means that of that 1,000, 850 of those students will be identified, 150 of them will not be identified. So 150 of them will be, that is a false negative, okay? It means also that of the 9,000 who do not have a language disorder, 90 of them will come up with a language disorder, and 8,910 of them will not have a language disorder. So you see how that kind of balances out. That 1.5 standard deviation cutoff, while what that does for us is it really it limits the amount of students we include in a group. But we do also have a larger number of false negatives. So depending on what you're actually assessing for, that you have to take that into consideration. However, what's important is that by following best practice, we as practitioners significantly cut the false negative rate. We do this by adding additional data points to help us identify characteristics of a disorder. We add in observation, another test score, etc., and that reduces the negative test results, because of all the students that may have come up as not having a disorder in this 150 range here, this 150 number, by adding another data point, we may include them in a diagnosis. So let's say we observe, we have another test, whatever, we significantly cut down that negative test result rate. Let me show you another example here, which is, I have this slide up here. You know, October is breast cancer awareness month. So I put this together based on approximate numbers of breast cancer prevalence. This is just to really show show this point another way. But basically, these are approximates based on a 12% prevalence rate, right? Based on how accurate mammograms are, okay? Basically, if we have 1,000 people with a 12% prevalence rate, that means 120 people of that 1,000 will have breast cancer. Of that 120 people, with a mammogram, based on the current accuracy of mammograms that's well published, about 100 of those folks are going to be identified, and about 20 of them will show up as false negatives, and that's approximately 17%. Of the 880 folks who do not have breast cancer in that group of 1,000, 62 of them will come up as false positives. That's approximately 7% rate, and 818 of them will show that they do not have it, right? So that's an accurate representation. So this meaning, again, that the false negative rate here, if you add in a clinical exam to this, you increase the number of diagnoses by four times. And this is based on information that I was able to find on mammograms. That means that really the false negative rate is cut down significantly when doctors use multiple data points to aid in diagnoses, right? So family history, clinical exam results, etc. And that's really I wanted to show you that again because, you know, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, just to show you the difference in how to really accurately interpret sensitivity and specificity. Let me get to this last slide here because we are right at the end of our time here, just to give you a quick summary. Basically, when we're looking at a quick summary of the information, hopefully you all got a lot of information out of this. But reliability is a reflection of error. It's how much error, systematic or random, that we can accept in a test. Validity, it helps us determine how we apply test interpretations and predict certain performance. So we want to make sure that we can apply certain predictions to a performance to make decisions. And really, choosing that cutoff does have implications for including or not including people in groups. That's really important to remember. Okay, so I do see that we are at the end of the time here. Okay, folks. I'm going to let Nancy come back on the line and give you some additional information. If I didn't get to any questions, I will get to those. I can maybe put those together in a question and answer format. Nancy?
All right, thanks, Adam. Okay. I got a message that some of y'all don't have the participant form number. It doesn't show on your reader. So if your participant form happens to be missing that, the course number is 1406. Remember, if you are listening to the live webinar and want to earn ASHA CEUs, you need to mail your ASHA CEU participant form to the address listed on speechandlanguage.com, and you'd search for webinar forms. It must be postmarked by November 4th, and only those participants who follow the instructions for earning ASHA CEUs will have their course information submitted to the ASHA CE registry. No CEUs are offered for the recording of this session that's available on the website after this program. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thanks, Adam.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the webinar for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your line.